Welcome to another encounter with the risen Lord. Today's encounter is that familiar, beloved story of the two disciples walking along the road to Emmaus who have a stranger draw alongside. Now, this story is only told in Luke's gospel. Luke has already spoken of the resurrection by way of the several women who go to the tomb and are greeted by two men in dazzling garments who send them to go and tell the others that Jesus is risen, has gone ahead of them to Galilee, and they are to meet him there. They run to tell the news, but they are not believed. Their words seem as nonsense, says Luke. Peter does in fact run to the tomb to check things out, but finding only the folded cloths, he leaves confused. So thus far, Jesus has not yet appeared. Now the text tells us that it is 60 stadia, or 7 miles, from Jerusalem to Emmaus. But these are not flat paved roads. Travel east-west is particularly difficult because of the hills. Now Rome has built roads, in fact 50,000 miles of them throughout the Mediterranean, broad stone roads for them to swiftly move their troops and resupply them. There are 3 of these in Palestine running north-south along the shore, along the east coast of the Jordan, and along the watershed ridge line. But the east-west roads are really basically pathways. Most of these roads are simply ways worn smooth by sandaled feet, pathways where actually a good portion of the Gospels take place. Jesus and his followers spent long hours and days traveling these kinds of roads. It was here they had their conversations. They asked Jesus questions, and he taught them using parables and conversation and story. So perhaps it is not surprising that this is the place where he appears to these two particular followers. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. And behold, on that very day, 2 of them were going to a village named Emmaus, which was 60 stadia from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things which had taken place. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are these words that you are exchanging with one another as you are walking?" And they came to a stop, looking sad. One of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, "Are you possibly the only one living near Jerusalem who does not know about the things that happened here in these days?" And he said to them, "What sorts of things?" And they said to him, "Those about Jesus the Nazarene, who proved to be a prophet mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things happened. But also some women among us left us bewildered when they were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. And so some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just exactly as the women had said. But him they did not see." And then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to come into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things written about himself in all the scriptures. And they approached the village where they were going, and he gave the impression that he was going farther. And so they strongly urged him, saying, "Stay with us, for it is getting toward evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. And it came about, when he had reclined at the table with them, that he took the bread and blessed it. And he broke it and began giving it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to one another, "Were our hearts not burning within us when he was speaking to us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us?" And they got up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem, and found the 11 gathered together, and those who were with them, saying, "The Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon." And they began to relate their experiences on the road, and how he was recognized by them at the breaking of the bread. The word of the Lord. This story is the longest one of the various resurrection appearances, and it develops along the storyline. We actually see that these two disciples encounter Jesus in a variety of ways. They will first encounter Jesus as a companion, and they will do so in their own small community of one another and him. They will encounter him as he breaks open the word and explains it. They will recognize him in the breaking of the bread, and then lastly, in going to tell the others. But first, they meet him as a companion who simply draws alongside. I don't know how many of you are walkers, but I find that in the rhythm of walking, the physicality of movement, the openness of out of doors, it creates a kind of ease for exchange. And that can happen with another who walks with you. It can happen even if that other is silent, like a faithful canine companion. It can even happen when one seems to be alone. Let me share an old fable with you. The story is told of a time long ago, in a village at the edge of a far-flung kingdom, a village so remote that it lacked many of the niceties of life, and in fact, folks barely made ends meet. Were it not for an unknown benefactor, they might not have survived at all. But baskets of food occasionally appeared. New clothing showed up as children grew, and occasional coins were found when they were most needed. There were more than the usual number of characters in this village. One of them was an elderly, grouchy man who walked about at the close of every day, bent and mumbling to himself, seemingly grousing about nothing and everything. He had no family or relations that anyone knew of, and most folks did not even know his name. He had become simply the grouchy old man. Children were afraid of him, and adults crossed the street to avoid him. One night, after his usual rounds, the man headed up the hill toward home and into the sunset. Suddenly, another grew alongside and said to him, "I am here to take you home." "I know the way home," said the man in a huff. "No, you do not understand. I am an angel of God, sent to take you to your eternal home of heaven." The man laughed. "You are mistaken. I do not even believe in God. I do not believe in you, and I certainly don't believe in heaven. And even if I did, I have done nothing to deserve it. Ask anyone here, and they will tell you I am just the old town grouch, They are all afraid of me. It is true that they are afraid of you, but it is also true that food and clothes and coins have appeared where you have trod. Oh, that, he said, it is little enough. I do it because God does not. Good proof enough that he does not exist. And I complain, that's what I do. I rail against the poverty, I rant against the indignities and slurs of life, the suffering I see all around. I never go to church. I never bend my knee. That is for believers, not for me. No, I have never even lifted my voice to pray. To whom do you think you have been speaking all these nights as you walk? To whom, if not to God? And what is that, if not prayer? He has listened to your every word. He has been beside you with every step. Come now. Come to your home where waits the God who has walked beside you all of your days. T.S. Eliot has also put words around this experience of the stranger alongside. And in these lines from his poem, The Wasteland, he evokes not only the road to Emmaus, but also our life's journey. And they honor a presence that is unseen, but always there, a presence of which we are only ever partially aware. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another who is walking beside you, gilding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that on the other side of you? When Jesus draws alongside and joins these two in conversation, he becomes a part of the community that they are. So what do we know of these two who are traveling along the road? They are clearly part of a larger group of Jesus's followers because they speak of some of our number. And they are completely absorbed in this conversation that they are having. They are distressed. They say, we had hoped. So we know that their hearts are anguished, and we can presume a certain amount of weariness from the road itself and from the toll of these last several days. And again, like the first station, we are given the name of one, but not the other. So what do we know about the one identified as Cleopas? Well, this is the only time the name appears, so we know very little. But folks have noticed the similarity between Cleopas and Clopas, who is mentioned elsewhere. And they have debated about the possibility that these could be one and the same. Now, the names are not linguistically related. Cleopas is Greek, and Clopas is presumed to be Semitic. But grammarians tell us that in the linguistically diverse culture that was first century Palestine, that kind of association could occur. So, what is the relationship between the two? Well, that answer depends a great deal about how you answer the Cleopas-Clopas question, because the one time that Clopas is mentioned is in John 19:25, when John says of one of the women at the foot of the cross that she is Mary, the wife of Clopas. So if Cleopas and Clopas are one and the same, then we could be looking at a married couple, Cleopas, and his wife Mary, who were on their way home after the Passover in Jerusalem and all that has happened. There's just no way to know. But it is an intriguing and actually real possibility. So the question becomes, how might this change the story for you if this were a married couple traveling along with Jesus and into whose home Jesus is invited to come and share a meal? Next, our two disciples experience Jesus in the Word. Now, the first thing that happens when Jesus draws alongside these two is, then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them the things written about himself in all the scriptures. So rich was this experience of coming to understand the scriptures through Jesus' teaching that they press him to stay longer. And when later they recall what that was like, they will say, "Were not our hearts burning within us when he was speaking to us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us?" In our next encounter in the upper room, Jesus also opened their minds to understanding the scriptures. And this of itself speaks to the importance and the centrality of the Word of God. It is a starting point for coming to understanding. And at this point, I think we can begin to identify that these 5 stages we've talked about from the beginning are more than an outline for the plot. They are an archetype, if you will, for the faith journey. The centerpiece of this story, the recognition of Jesus in the breaking of the bread. Once again, let us look to see how this has been portrayed in art. The 17th century Spanish artist Diego Velázquez imagined a scene from the point of view of a servant girl who might have been there. Velázquez gives us a fascinating example of entering into the story through a different point of view, in this case of the servant girl. Now, he paints a Moorish servant, as would have been common in his time and place. And while the ethnicity would very likely have been different in Jesus's time and place, the kind of setting and sentiment remains the same. See, now you actually have to look closely at that upper left-hand corner, and through the passage window, recognize that this is indeed Luke 24. The folks at table are very nonplussed. They have not yet recognized what the servant girl has. The poet Denise Levertov has created a remarkable reflection upon this painting called The Servant Girl at Emmaus. She listens, holding her breath. Surely that voice is his, the one who had looked at her once across the crowd as no one ever had looked, had seen her, had spoken as if to her. Surely those hands were his, taking the platter of bread from hers just now. Hands he'd laid on the dying and made them well. Surely that face, the man they'd crucified for sedition and blasphemy, the man whose body disappeared from its tomb, the man, it was rumored now, some women had seen this morning alive. Those who had brought this stranger home to their table don't recognize yet with whom they sit. But she, in the kitchen, absently touching the wine jug she's to take in. A young black servant, intently listening, swings round and sees the light around him and is sure. So the servant girl comes to recognize who he is before the disciples do. But what about them? He took bread, pronounced the blessing, then broke the bread and began to distribute it to them. And with that, their eyes were opened. This, of course, is a ritual action familiar to Christians. It is also a ritual action within Judaism. It is an action that Jesus did just nights before at the Last Supper. So it could perhaps be the very familiarity of what he is doing here, something that he has perhaps done before in their company, that causes them to remember and to recognize. This action remains a central part of Christian liturgy and a time when we encounter Jesus in a real and distinctly personal way, a time to remember and recognize who he is. Lastly, Jesus is encountered in going to tell others. And when they do, before a word is out of their mouths, they are the ones who are greeted with the news. He has been raised, it is true. He has appeared to Simon. So somewhere in that same time frame of that afternoon, evening of that same day of the resurrection, there's been another appearance of which we are not told. And this reminds us that Jesus appeared many other times beyond the ones we are covering in this series. We use these because these are the ones that are described in the scriptures. But there are others that happened and that are attested to, as we have Paul pointing out in his letter to 1 Corinthians about the risen Christ. He was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. After that, he was seen by 500 brothers at once, most of whom are still alive, although some have fallen asleep. Next, he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. So now let's look not just at the remarkable news that they themselves heard when they came to tell their news, but also who it is that greets them. That same hour, they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. The 11 gathered together and those who were with them. The 11 and their friends. So you will have various renderings in different translations, but all attesting to the fact that it is not just the 11 who are there. The Bible frequently titles this section, Jesus appears to the 11, or Jesus appears to the disciples. And this is an important reminder to us that the text, the scriptures, do name who is there, but they don't always name everyone who is there. In other words, there may well have been others not of the same significance who are not mentioned, kind of like that line in Matthew, not counting women and children. This line, verse 33, says the 11 and their companions were gathered there. If we look elsewhere in 2 verses from Acts, we get a little more description pointing toward who these companions might be. After Luke has described the ascension, he has them return to the upper room and says, those present were Peter, John, James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas son of James. They all joined together constantly in prayer, along with the women, and Mary the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. And Luke further opens the scene for Pentecost by saying, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. This is why you will frequently see in art for the Pentecost, the descent of the Holy Spirit, you'll see Mary seated among the apostles. So, who was there in that room when the disciples from Emmaus came barging in with their news? Well, I think we can imagine as many or as few as we choose. I think it's fascinating how we have come full circle here. You know, every liturgy ends with our being sent forth, not as in we're done now, go home, but sent forth, as was Mary Magdalene, as were the women at the tomb, as were these two disciples. We too are sent forth to tell the others and to encounter the risen Lord. So I invite you in this coming week to consider all these various ways in which we meet Jesus along this road, this journey that we call life. Thank you for joining me again, and next week I will meet you with the others in the upper room.